we go. Okay, now we're live. It also gives me a chance just to, so I do want to mention just about Sarah. She is the Municipal Assistance Center's Government Finance Specialist, get the title right there. And she is, was on the board of directors of the Vermont GFOA for a number of years, stepped down from that, but is a certified public finance officer with GFOA, which is a real effort to accomplish, and it speaks to her acumen in this field generally. So moving around here, we're also joined by Julie Hance, who is the town manager in the town of Chester. She was formerly an assistant town manager there and stepped up in 2020, just in March 2020, just in time to get into what has obviously been a very difficult couple of years, so trial by fire for sure. But prior to that, she has a background as a paralegal, was an assistant town manager for 15 years, and is someone who has led a number of improvements there, at least that I know of, working with her at the bond bank. Chester, we're also joined by some folks from Woodstock. So Bill Kerbin, the newish town manager down there. Bill comes to Vermont from Virginia and also has a stop along the way in New York, and has been there, I think, about a year and a half, Bill, or so. Get Bill's video started there. And also in Woodstock, we're joined by Jonathan Wilson, who is a member of the capital committee that helps Woodstock with their now award-winning capital plan, and is a volunteer, but in his day job works at a very great institution at Lawson's Finest Liquids. Can't say that's probably the most exciting part of anyone's bio, I think, this morning. But it is just early, so we'll get to that later in the day here, at least at the bond bank. And then finally, Aaron Frank, town manager at the city of Colchester. Aaron's worked in a number of capacities in, I guess, infrastructure, you'd say. He worked as a private consultant in land use development, but also worked at Green Mountain Transit for a number of years. So, if you're an infrastructure geek, Aaron has quite a bit of background and has been town manager there for a number of years, and does a great job with their plan, their capital plan. You're going to hear more about it in the session here. So with that, I'll kick it off to Sarah to help us get started. And the sort of format of this will be Sarah will sort of discuss the nuts and bolts of a capital plan, and then we'll go around the room hearing from folks their experiences with capital planning in each of the communities we introduce. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Michael. I think that you are going to have to make me a host to share my screen, please. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on day 2, the Capital Planning Forum. This morning, we're going to talk about some of the basics on really how to get started. There we go. You should be seeing my full screen slide at this point. I see a nod. Awesome. Thanks, Julie. Give some thumbs up. Good. Okay, so this morning, we're going to get back to basics. We're going to talk about really how to get started, or one of many ways on how to get started, and then maintaining that momentum. As Michael mentioned, I've recently joined the Vermont League of Cities and Towns in the Municipal Assistance Center as their government finance specialist, which is very exciting, as one of my favorite things is governmental accounting. And so now I get to talk to people all day, every day about governmental accounting, and it is just a ton of fun. So far, almost every question has stumped me at first, but it is always fun to talk to folks about what they're up to in their municipalities. Prior to that, as Michael mentioned, I've been in a handful of municipalities in Chittenden and Franklin County over the last 13 years. And as we'll go along, we're going to talk about sort of this general overview of capital planning, but I can tell you right now that I've been involved in 5 different capital plans, and I have used 5 very different methods to compile and report data. And so that really speaks to how each municipality is a little bit unique. And along the way, just considering how do you layer in the unique needs and priorities of your community into this overall baseline framework will help you as you're developing things. So let's get started. My plan for us is to talk about just a couple of definitions. I want to make a few distinctions. I heard Brad mention some of these terms yesterday, so you already have some definitions under your belts. Then we're going to talk about a really broad, practical scope of information, scope for creating a capital plan from the ground up. My goal is for everyone to be able to see themselves maybe in one or more of the steps, so that when you leave, you have an idea, you know, okay, well, we should go here next if we're in the middle, or if we're going to get started, where do we even start with this mountain of data and information? And some of you might be already at the end and working your way back through the cycle again. So hopefully this will lay a foundation for you no matter where you are in the process. After that, we're going to talk about some related policies, just at a high level, touch on some things that would be helpful in framing the process. And I have a few additional resources before we go around the room and we hear from the experience of Chester, Woodstock, and Colchester, which I think is going to be very interesting for everyone. So let's start with these definitions, and really distinctions is what I want to talk about. So the first distinction that I'd like to make for our purposes today, and for as you're thinking about putting together your capital plan, is a distinction between a capital asset and a capital project. And for me, this distinction comes through most clearly when we get into summarizing all of the data that we're going to gather. So for planning purposes, I like to lump together groups of like items to really allow our decision makers and our residents to get up out of the weeds and see the landscape of capital planning at a higher level. This is most clearly seen when we have maybe a fleet of vehicles in the highway department or the sewer department or police or fire. Instead of planning for each individual vehicle separately, we might lump them all together into one project so that we can see at a higher level what is our overall funding needs for this fleet. And that allows us to have fewer discrete items or projects to look at and talk about along the way. A quick note while we're talking about vehicles here, you may already have a vehicle replacement schedule in your entity. That's fantastic. That's going to be a great place to start as part of your capital planning, but it does not in and of itself constitute a capital plan. So grab that, bring it with you, and keep going on your capital planning journey. This distinction may also be seen in larger entities where you have a certain threshold for capital asset, maybe in your audit, that you would capitalize something over $5,000 with a life of 1 year or more for audit purposes, but maybe you're large enough so that for planning purposes, you really only put like projects that are $50,000 or more through your capital planning process. And the intent of that distinction is to only apply the increased scrutiny of the CIP process to the most significant investments and not get bogged down with a large number of lower threshold purchases. Like I said, that's probably going to be seen mostly in much larger entities. And for the majority of us, this distinction is really individual line items versus grouping like items together for the plan. The next distinction that I'd like to make is between the capital plan and the capital budget. And so the capital plan, which we also are going to hear or have heard called the capital improvement plan, the capital program, the capital improvement program, or just CIP for short, is a multi-year look at the capital needs of your organization. And then the capital budget is a piece of that. It's really, once you have that broad plan, picking up that first year of information and plugging that into your capital projects fund or your general ledger to serve as your budget and your plan for the first year. Speaking of capital projects funds, this is the last thing I really want to point out before we dive into the step-by-step portion of what I want to share with everyone. Governmental funds, governmental accounting in GASB 54, governments have the option of using a capital projects fund in their governmental fund types. And a capital projects fund may be used to account for capital outlays and projects. I recommend establishing one of these. I think one of the primary funding sources that I see for capital planning is transfers from the general fund. So in your annual general fund operating budget, you have certain line items that are going to go to fund reserves for various capital items. And I think actually transferring these dollars, like from the debits and credits side of things, moving these dollars out of the general fund and parking them into a capital project fund allows you to accumulate those dollars over time and then expend them for their stated purposes out of that capital project fund, which I think really increases transparency. It makes it a little more clear what's happening, and it takes the inherent volatility out of capital spending out of the operating budget. On the enterprise fund side of things, GASB doesn't have a similar fund structure available, but that you could certainly consider using a separate fund for internal purposes that just gets rolled up for the audit. Okay, done with definitions and distinctions, and we're on to the step-by-step process. So like I said a little bit earlier, I think it's really going to vary greatly from entity to entity, but I think we can generally boil this down to: do we need to do it? Who's going to do it? How are they going to do it? Now, go do it, review it, approve it, and repeat. And those get translated into this generic 7 steps that you're seeing on your screen now. We're going to walk through these one by one, but generally, when we're coming right out of the gate, we haven't done this in a while, or we're setting up a new plan, we need to determine the need and establish buy-in. And then we need to set some parameters. What are the rules of the game? The heavy lift for year 1 is gathering all the data and then summarizing and organizing it in a meaningful way. We need to rank and prioritize projects because there's never going to be enough resources to meet all of the needs. Unfortunately, I wish I could tell you a different message there, but I am sure you've all experienced this firsthand. And then we need to present the plan, have the board adopt it. And then this process doesn't end. The last step here is review, revise, and repeat year after year, forever. So step 1. So whether you're starting from scratch or you're giving your existing process a reboot, I really think it's important to get everyone on board from the outset. You want to identify the need and establish buy-in from your select board, other elected officials or volunteer committees that are going to be involved, management, and really your department heads as well, as they're going to be doing a lot of the input work. This is going to ensure that everyone involved has a heads up about what's coming, and it gives the overall project priority status in the long list of priorities, which I'm sure all of them are ranked number 1 on your priority list, but we got to get this one on there somewhere. Having the official blessing from the select board right out of the gate is really going to help set you off on the right foot. And I think that the most effective way to get the blessing and buy-in from the select board actually accomplishes 2 things. It establishes the buy-in here in step 1, and it helps set some of the parameters that we're going to talk about next. And that is updating or adopting a capital planning policy. The select board is going to be heavily involved in the process toward the end, reviewing, making decisions, and adopting and updating the plan. And so having them on board from the outset with what are the parameters within which we're going to consolidate and present projects and go through this process is going to really help in the long run, making sure that they're not surprised by anything at the 11th hour. If this is a new initiative in your government, I would suggest giving some consideration to the rollout internally and possibly what specific change management practices you might want to employ. because I'm sure everyone is already buried in other priorities. And so clearly communicating the expectations and the benefits early and often is going to help all of your staff members, everybody internally, get this on their calendar and on their list so they know what's coming. Step 2 is also quite important, and that's defining the rules of the game. And this happens quite nicely through the capital planning policy, but we'll see in the next slide as well, there's also some things that are going to happen outside of policy development. The policy is going to determine the scope of your plan. It'll lay out how many years you're going to cover. A common approach that I've seen is a 5-year plan, which is, the upcoming budget year plus 4 years of projections. These also come in longer scopes as well. I've heard some GFOA conference speakers suggest making your plan the length of your longest debt, which is a little bit excessive maybe if your longest debt is 30 years, but that does help you start to think way down the road, okay, we're paying for this big thing now, eventually we're going to have to do something with it. Are we prepared? So none of those things, those larger things in particular, are a surprise. Included in the scope is going to be defining what constitutes a capital project and or a capital asset, like we talked about before, for your government. And that is going to provide the basis for separating potential investments that'll undergo that increased CIP scrutiny from those that'll be reviewed as part of the operating budget. Every government establishes some kind of arbitrary cutoff point that distinguishes current from capital expenditures. As I mentioned when we're talking about definitions, this can be something like, well, anything that exceeds $5,000 and has an estimated useful life greater than 1 year. Or if you're a smaller entity, that dollar threshold might be smaller. If you're a larger entity, it might be bigger. So these are some considerations that are going to vary town from town, depending on your individual circumstances. You may find in your particular government as well that you have some specific exclusions from capital assets that you want to list out in your capital planning policy. And this would be items that function more like operating expenses. For example, if you have a police department that purchases 2 or 3 new police cars every single year, year after year, those really start to take on the character of an operating expense, in my opinion, as opposed to a capital expense, and they can maybe be moved back into the operating budget. So if you have any exceptions like that, the other one I can think of is computers. Computers are less and less expensive and more disposable is my experience. And they could probably make their way into the operating budget and out of the CIP if you find that you have too many things going on in your capital plan. Your policy should also include information on who's responsible for the various aspects of the CIP, and in particular, assigning clear responsibility for evaluating and ranking projects. And I think creating the final component so that you make sure that you can get it over the finish line. We'll talk about ranking projects in a few minutes, but I do want to make a quick distinction here. As I mentioned before, there's not going to be enough resources to fund everything. So deciding what makes the cut and what has to wait or get shelved will be just a whole lot easier if there's a clear objective process for making that decision. The full ranking criteria does not need to be in the policy, but I think that the policy should clearly state a requirement that there is a ranking criteria developed and used. Lastly, in your policy, you may have information on your funding strategy. For example, if your board is keen on pay-as-you-go financing as opposed to debt, that's something you can memorialize in your policy. If there's always circumstances where you're going to debt finance certain types of assets, that could go in the policy as well. We're going to talk a little bit later this morning about debt management and a debt management policy. So some of these policy components cross over as you're going along. I would suggest they don't have to be repetitive, but they should definitely, your different policies should definitely complement each other, not contradict each other. So if you're going to put any of these aspects in your capital planning policy, I would want to ensure that they correspond with your other policies as well. Some of the rules of the game are going to live outside of that official policy because they need to be more fluid, or they're really procedural items. And these would include decisions on what data characteristics you're going to gather in your data collection process, like what are the different department categories? What are the asset categories? What are the different funding sources? You're going to need to hammer out that ranking and prioritization criteria if you haven't already done that. And then for internal purposes, making sure that there's a timeline and expectations for who's going to do what, when, and how it's going to be reviewed and incorporated is going to be important for everyone working on the project. So I know that you can't read the words in this slide. I can't read them. I can't read them either, but I want you to just absorb the beautiful colored flow chart that you're looking at. While I was preparing for this workshop, I came across a capital improvement plan policy and CIP ranking criteria from the city of Lawrence, Kansas. And it's linked in this slide. When the slides are distributed, you'll be able to click that hyperlink and be taken right there. I was really impressed with what the city of Lawrence had put together. I thought it was thorough, it wasn't too long, and it was totally scalable. And so what you see here are appendix or exhibit items from their capital improvement plan policy, which shows exactly step by step how the CIP is developed, how it gets approved. They also had another exhibit on how it would get amended if you wanted to change something mid-year. But this type of document is really helpful to setting up the rules of the game, making sure everyone knows what to expect. And this document serves a dual purpose in my mind. If this is in your policy or even just your procedure, every year you could print this out, add some due dates, pass it around, and voila, you also have a timeline and everyone knows what is due to who and when. All right, now we are into the heavy lift in year one, which is gathering your data. The finance office is going to have some of this information already from the insurance renewal or the annual audit. And my recommendation would be to start with the most comprehensive list that you already have. Hopefully it's already in Excel or a database if you're using that. I would make a copy of it so we don't want to mess up the original data. Add on anything that you know is missing. So make sure if it's the audit list, for example, grab that insurance renewal, make sure those items are on there as well, and start adding columns or fields for the additional data that you want to collect about these assets. Once you have in one place all of your known items, it's time to solicit input from the other departments. So this could start out with just sharing the spreadsheet. Say, hey, take a look at what we have here. Please add anything we're missing. Let me know if there's anything that's not there anymore. What condition is it in? When do you expect we're going to need to replace it? What do you think the cost of replacing is going to be? Those individual department heads or department managers are going to know a lot more about the condition and the life and what it's going to take to replace an asset than the manager or the finance director sitting in their office going through this data. Once you have that, if that doesn't give you a complete picture, and even if it does, I find a on-site physical inventory to be a lot of fun and very informative. And this is where you take your laptop or a printout of the sheet and you would schedule time to go to all the different departments, all the different sites, and look at every asset that's on that list. It's been a few years since I've had the opportunity to do this, but I have historically scheduled a couple days at the end of June to go around and make sure we still have all the vehicles that our auditors thought we had. Oh, yep, that really is the VIN number. How many miles, what condition is it in, etc. So as I just touched on, this sounds like a lot of work, but you can actually get a few things checked off your list on a physical inventory. Bring your insurance renewal packet, update that while you're doing this. Bring your audit list, update that as well. If you bought any of those assets with federal dollars, I'm sure you all already know this, but you're required to do a physical inventory of them at least once every 2 years. We don't need to raise hands on who's doing that or not, but you could do that as part of your CIP data gathering initiative. And it really is helpful to get out of the office, see what everyone else is doing on the ground. And I think that overall it helps the finance department in particular build a better understanding of the interconnectedness of the budget, financial reporting, and then what's really happening on the ground. So once you have a good handle on what you already have, so your existing assets and projects, it's time to gather any information on new initiatives from department heads, manager, from other planning documents, or your elected officials. And then also layer in any outside objective data that you have access to. So a pavement condition index, a sidewalk condition index, any sort of engineering reports as well. So you have all of that data. It's time to organize it. If you're using Excel, I would recommend maybe taking time to set up some data validation tables so that a few typos don't skew your whole report. Or if you're using a database, that's probably already set up for you behind the scenes. In summarizing the data, this is where we're going to go from capital asset to capital project. And in doing that, I would recommend grouping like items together. This is going to allow you to have a better sense of what are the different pots that I need to focus on, as opposed to every single little line item. One of the ways that you can do this is to create project sheets. So you have your big database, you're summarizing everything, and then as you get your groupings together, pull that data out and put it in individual project sheets. And that's really going to be the basis from which you review and develop your CIP. So we are finally getting into actually developing the CIP now that we've gotten through all of the foundational items in the data collection. Your project sheets will include information like the project name, a unique project number, who's the responsible department, what is the rank of this project, which fund does it live in, a description, what are the revenue sources, what are the expenditures over all the years, and then any additional relevant data that you want to add in there, like what's the general ledger like expense account. If it's a summary project, you might want to actually have the list of all the vehicles there, even though you're planning for them as a group. Now that you have all of that together, the next step in the list that I put together is identifying and assigning funding sources. Now, you may have done some of this along the way. For example, as your department heads are talking about what assets they have and when they need to be replaced, you may already have been saving up for truck 4, or you may know that there's a grant coming for your SCBA equipment in the fire department, or you already have a bond approved by the voters that hasn't quite been issued yet. So you might already have some of those funding sources in there, but I'm sure that there's going to be at least some projects that have outflows and no associated inflows. So if your goal is to have a balanced CIP, which is probably a good goal, then we need to get back to our funding strategy. And some of the components might have been laid out early on when you were setting the parameters. For example, any equipment with a life less than 5 years, we're going to use pay-as-you-go financing. And so you'll be able to make some decisions within those parameters. But there are going to be some holes. There are probably going to be some gray areas. I think about policies setting sort of like the ultimate, taking the very wide spectrum of things you can do and bringing it in enough to have some direction, but not so much that you don't have any flexibility. And so really what's going to happen in this part is managing that gray area between the parameters set by the policy or the boards at the beginning. And one of the things that's going to help you do that is having a clear ranking structure. So you have your list of assets, you know what needs to be replaced, you know what it's going to cost, and you don't have enough available resources. So now what? You've got to decide what makes the cut, what gets postponed, what drops off the list completely. I think the most important takeaway here is that a project ranking and prioritization should be based on an objective, predetermined set of criteria, which will provide transparency and justification for how decisions are made. In addition to ending up with a prioritized project list, the other goal of this step is to promote procedural justice. Procedural justice deals with the perception of fairness in a process that's used to allocate limited resources. And the cornerstone for our purposes here is actual and perceived neutrality when we're ranking projects. You certainly don't want to get to the end of the project and see, oh, the public works director took the lead on putting the CIP together and all of his trucks or all of her trucks were funded this year and everyone else had cuts. Even if that did happen through a neutral process, that has the perception of favoritism. And so if you have a clear prioritization policy that you can point back to, it really can help dissolve any of those hard feelings. Another underlying concept I just want to touch on in ranking and prioritizing projects is that I think we really need to take care of what we already have first before expanding. So since capital assets are essential to delivering services to our communities, we have to prioritize the ones we already have to ensure that they're in good working order and we maintain those already established levels of services before we start to take on new initiatives. The concern would be a new initiative would take resources away from an existing initiative. And so while it's fun and flashy to start something new, build something new, if that then means you don't have the resources or the manpower to take care of what you already have, those service levels are going to drop. And that's not great. It's a very technical term. It's just not great. People aren't going to love that. Another consideration, though, is if you have things on this list that just aren't serving your community anymore, maybe your priorities have changed. There's no need to continue to renew and replace a specific asset just because it's always been renewed and replaced. And so part of the evaluating what you have in the projects would be a time to say, is this still serving us? And if the answer is no, take it off the list and redirect those resources somewhere else, maybe to the new and flashy project. All right, we're back to the city of Lawrence, Kansas. Later today, I'm going to email them and tell them how much I enjoyed their documents. I've got a link here to their prioritization plan. This is another document that was very well laid out. It was pretty short, it was highly detailed, and it was totally scalable. What you can see on the screen is the scoring sheet that they have right in their prioritization summary document, which is more of a procedure than a policy. It's something that happens internally. They have 9 categories, which is probably plenty. When setting something like this up, we really want to strike a balance between being detailed enough to differentiate similar projects from one another without getting really bogged down in the details. I think that the categories you're seeing here on the screen are pretty standard, and they're really a reflection of the goals and priorities of the community. In other ranking criteria, I've seen categories such as safety and health, a consideration of the remaining useful life in an asset, how much community support it got, and then linkages to other projects. You know, for example, if you have a water line on your list that's going to be coming up in 5 years, but you're going to replace that road in 3 years, you might want to make sure that you reverse the order of those 2 projects so you're not digging up new pavement. So the nice thing about the document from the city of Lawrence, which there's the hyperlink, can't remember if I already said this on the screen, I highly recommend checking it out if you're looking to make updates or establish a ranking criteria. Further on in the document, they have very clear definitions of what each of these categories is looking at. And for the evaluators, what questions should you ask yourself, and precisely how a project would get a score of, in this example, 0, 1, 2, or 3 in this category. So we're going back here to procedural justice. There's really no question about how did, project A rank a 2 on strategic plan alignment. Well, it aligns with 2 of the project indicators in our strategic plan. And per this document, that's how it got a 2. They have some others in here. I'm just going to flash up on the screen very quickly. Regulatory compliance, again, so every single one of the categories has a very clear outline of what you should be thinking about when you're reviewing and how the scoring happens. And the last one is just if there's external funding. I do think that whether or not there's external funding is a good indicator for any ranking criteria, because if you don't have to spend taxpayer dollars on it, that's always a good thing. Unless, of course, it creates a burden for future taxpayers. So you've got to take that in consideration as well, right? There's no such thing as free money. Okay, we're rounding the corner. At this point, you have all of your projects, you have them ranked, you have a balanced CIP, and it's time to pull it all together. And so I think that a document to your elected officials would include narrative information about what you've done, what some of the parameters were that you used, summary data on all of those projects, and then those individual project sheets so the elected officials can get into what's happening, ask questions, and make decisions. The final step, once the board is good with it, is adoption. You are required to hold a public hearing before the board adopts a capital improvement plan. So make sure you make time for that. But once that's done, the select board can adopt the plan, and then that first year becomes your capital budget, as we mentioned earlier on. And once it's adopted, it's time to put it on a shelf and never think about it again. Just kidding. That's not true. I know that's what we all want to do. I can tell you that every year that I've been in municipal government, I've thought to myself along the way, oh, as soon as this is over, I'm going to pull up those templates. I'm going to make these changes. And inevitably, 13 out of 13 years, I have not. I have breathed a big sigh of relief, and I have saved those files for next year. So it's easy to do, right? Don't be so hard on yourself if that's what you do. But if you do, if you have an opportunity, once it's been approved, is a great time to review and revise your process. I think that putting this on the calendar, putting a debrief on the calendar as part of your original timeline might help you maintain this particular meeting with everyone once everything is done. But even if you take some notes along the way and file those in your file for next year, like, oh, wow, we really should change the header of these project sheets, at least you'll have something. Which brings me to maintaining momentum. And as I've just alluded to, the best way to maintain momentum is to never stop moving. And that is really the review process here. And so, as I mentioned, schedule that post-adoption debrief as part of your initial timeline. Then it's on everyone's calendar. If you put it on everyone's calendar, then I'm sure you'll have at least a few people who will remind you that you have forgotten something, and then you can get together and do the overview. I think inevitably things are going to come up while you're working through the process that could be done better. And then, like I mentioned previously, I would say instead of like stopping everything and making those changes along the way, making little notes of them and covering them at the debrief is a better time to do it. So it's deceivingly simple. It's like the weight loss advice to just eat right and exercise. Of course, it's easy enough in concept, very hard in practice. But if you happen to be able to get that debrief meeting on the calendar and just keep going and keep budgeting as an annual, or not annual thing, but an ongoing thing instead of once a year, that'll help you maintain the momentum and get you really going for future cycles. Just a note here about policies. So policies are a key aspect of sound financial management, providing guidance and ground rules for decision makers. And I really think they are central to strategic long-term approach to financial management, supporting fiscal prudence and really being a good steward of your taxpayer dollar. I want to make sure that we know the difference between a policy and procedure. So financial policies are guidelines for then decisions to be made, and they are implemented at the board level. And then procedures are the detailed internal day-to-day instructions on how to accomplish the business processes. I can just tell you right now, if you feel like your financial policies are limiting your flexibility and micromanaging your day-to-day work, your policies have probably crept into procedure realm, and they could be due for a revamp. We touched on capital planning policy and debt management policy while I was talking this morning, but other policies that could relate to the CIP process are a fund balance policy, which may specify unassigned fund balance over a certain threshold could be moved to capital reserve. You would have reserve policies, which would talk about maintaining reserves for emergency situations. So if you do have an extreme weather event, for example, your CIP doesn't get decimated because you all of a sudden have to reallocate all those resources to an emergency, or you may even have some long-term financial planning policies in place. Again, these are all hyperlinks to different things that you'll get when we share the slide deck out after the fact. VLCT has some model financial policies on our website, and I have a whole bunch of GFOA resources here as well, including information about fairness, which will touch on procedural justice, capital planning within the new financial foundations framework that GFOA has just come out with, some of their best practice and resources, their offerings, and I've linked here their budget award winners and their financial policy challenge. I like to go out and see what other people are doing to inform how I'm going to maybe structure different things. And so looking at their previous budget award winners hyperlinks you to those budget documents, and you can take a look at some other things. And then the financial policy challenge also has some examples. I have my contact information up here. If you're interested, you can grab that QR code and it'll plop me right into your database. I'm actually not going to take questions now because I want to move us on to our panel, starting up with Julie in Chester. And I'm going to, where's my mouse? Okay. Stop sharing, right in red. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Julie, oh, my screen changed. There you are. Hi. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to you to give us some information on capital planning and Chester's experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really informative. I'll definitely be looking at the documents from Lawrence as we move forward. A lot of really good ideas there. So I want to start with disclosing right up front that I am not an expert in capital planning or in finance. My background is in law and specifically in litigation. So I am learning a lot these 2 days. And I just really love to be around really smart people who are doing things well. So this is really, really helpful for me. The perspective for Chester is really more about lessons learned and where we are now. So Chester is a relatively small town, about 3,200 people, southern Vermont. But for a small town, we have a lot going on, a lot of activity, a lot of ideas, a lot of community involvement in the things that we are doing in our town. So there's a lot taking place in such a small town. In my experience, over my past 18 years of working in the town and with many different select boards over those years, we changed philosophies pretty dramatically. We went from a philosophy of always pay as you go, never wanting to borrow, debt is bad, to let's just finance everything and pay as you use. So pretty big swing in a relatively short period of time with no real planning that was involved. So boards of the past felt debt was bad. Caused obviously several issues, extreme spikes in our budget, 300,000 one year, nothing the next year, 600,000 the next year, and that's just not sustainable. Secondly, our equipment was not getting replaced, upgraded as needed. Buildings were not being maintained, etc. Everything was deferred maintenance. Everything was getting kicked down the road. Again, reality is that's not sustainable. And especially when you are in a town like Chester, whose citizens have a pretty high level of service that it demands from the town. Chester has a beautiful, quaint village, very historic, and the citizens expect that level of service. But when you don't have a plan and how to maintain that, eventually that's just going to all fall apart. So the board at that time then started to work with the town manager on the creation of a quote unquote capital plan. Unfortunately, the concept of a capital plan at that time really wasn't understood, and it was not all encompassing. So only equipment, and mostly highway equipment, was considered on a replacement schedule, and not even all of it. It was the big items, the grader, the trucks, the dump trucks, the fire trucks. It was not the pickup truck or the utility trailer for highway. It was just the big items. So, you know, we often create a spreadsheet and we make it pretty with fancy colors and good labeling and call it a capital plan. And I think one of the things Chester really learned is that's not a capital plan. That's a pretty spreadsheet where you've just organized some of your expenses. And at the end, it was not helpful. It was a good effort, but there was still the philosophy of borrow as little as you possibly can and only fix what's broken. So again, no real planning. And whatever little amount of planning there was no management of that plan. It would get pulled out every few years, not every year. It wasn't maintained. So we really did a poor job with that. But eventually things started to all come to the surface and fall apart. So historic buildings, leaks in roofs because roofs had never been maintained, caused damage to the inside of the building, trucks breaking down during snowstorms. I remember one storm, we have a fleet of 5 dump trucks. We had 3 of them out of service. We had 98 miles of dirt road in Chester. So plowing in a snowstorm with 2 dump trucks just doesn't work. We have a lot of mileage of sidewalks in Chester. Several of them fell apart at once. So we had a lot of repairs that needed to get made and relatively quickly. So that introduced us to the bond bank for the first time, and that was about in 2016, 2017. And the need to borrow, whether the board wanted to or not, borrowing at that point really was the only option. The board quickly, at that same time, we had a change in board. Almost a full change in board. We had four new members out of 5 that particular year. With that change came a whole different philosophy. Now it was borrow for everything. If we didn't have cash, we borrowed. Whether we actually needed it or not, we borrowed. And it only took 7 years to go from any form of planning, which was very limited, to nothing but really a debt repayment plan. Again, no planning. So lessons learned. So where are we now? Chester is at the very beginning. We are starting over. So we started in 2018 with a master plan of the village center, which is a tremendous asset to help with future planning and funding. Again, especially when you have a very historic downtown and village center that Chester does. I would say as a side, if your community does not have a master plan, I really, really encourage that process. It was a bridge for Chester to get from one place that we were at to another. And it was a really community unifying process for us. There's a lot of grant funding out there to help with that process in the state. So I encourage you, if you have never been through that, I really encourage you to. And it doesn't matter the size of your town. You can be a town of just a couple hundred, even less. A master plan process will be very informative, as it was for us. And it led us to recognize that in order to accomplish the things that our community really wanted, we needed to develop an overall plan that covered and encompassed all of Chester's municipal infrastructure. So we're taking a step back, we're starting over. We are currently working on develop our asset inventory. So step 3 of Sarah's capital planning process is where we're at right now. And that is, what do we have? And this is the time consuming part. It's going to take quite a bit of time to gather this information because it's never really been done here. So what do we have? What is the life of what we have? What are the priorities, costs, with all the things that have been talked about yesterday and Sarah talked about this morning? So our inventory is going to include everything from computers to pavement to water sewer lines to windows and roofs and kind of everything in between. Because again, we need to start really from ground zero and build up. Once we have that data, we will start, our planning. And this is why this couple days of events has been really helpful for me. But we'll start our planning and developing specific asset management plans for each department is kind of the avenue that we're going down. And those individual plans will contribute to the whole, which will contribute to the capital budget, and a capital fund eventually is where we would like to be. You know, for us, the task has seemed very daunting. For a small town, we don't have the resources that a lot of the bigger cities do. But I think that sometimes we as small towns really underestimate and undervalue what we have the ability to accomplish. And I think we need to remember that planning is really appropriate, and I think it's really a responsibility of municipalities. It's a responsibility to our taxpayers. As Mr. Harris said yesterday, you know, it's their money. It's not ours, and planning on its best use is definitely our responsibility. Chester is going to form a committee. We're going to try to form a committee with diverse representation between staff and community. And I think this is where small towns can do it well. You know, involving the community not only helps achieve the plan, but it lessens the workload for one person. I don't want my capital plan developed at my desk. That's not good. That's not good government. And bringing in the people from your community will definitely help accomplish a lot more in the end. And we learned that in our master plan process, the village center master plan process. You know, there's a statement made yesterday by somebody about administration not being an island. And, you know, that's really important to remember. In a small town, sometimes I do at my desk, I think, oh, I've got to do all this, but you know, I don't. The best thing is for this plan to be a document of the community. And so that is where Chester is heading, remembering that there is power when a small community unites itself around its common goal. And so that is where Chester is at. I am happy to speak with anybody who wants to learn more about our lessons learned. But we are putting the past in the past, and Chester is moving forward. We've got a lot of really exciting things going on here, and the capital planning process is really going to be a great process for us to define who we are as a community and what our long-term goals are. So that's all I have for us, for Chester.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. It sounds like next year you'll be hosting the How to Get Started and Keep Going session. We really appreciate you sharing Chester's experience with us. And next up, I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Wilson and Bill Kerbin from Woodstock. I was unable to attend the award ceremony yesterday afternoon, but I heard Woodstock's capital plan was among one of the award recipients. Congratulations, you guys. I do want to make sure everyone knows I recused myself from voting on that particular plan, and I shouldn't say this because I don't know if you're going to bring it up, but I expect Jonathan will touch on why. So Jonathan, I'm going to let you kick it off. I know you and Bill had some slides to share with the group.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, I'll quickly share screen. I know we don't have too much time, so I'll move along. Does that show up okay for folks? Great. So yes, so Sarah, we were lucky enough to use Sarah as a consultant on this project. And our project for the Capital Budget Committee over the past year was to formalize a process that had really been very informal for a number of years, and it worked. But the information was not really widely shared with folks. And it was a little opaque on how decisions were made and what our assets were and when they were coming up for replacement. So we tried to make a more formalized process that we used information. We gathered a lot, like Julie was just referring to, we gathered lots of information on all of our assets from various sources so that we had that in one space that the accounting team and department heads would have access to. And working with Sarah, we then put that into an Excel workbook, basically, that is categorized by capital projects or capital groups, departments. Each department head sort of has ownership for that area and we're able to keep that up and track needs as things roll off, and as new needs come on, we can put that on. So we developed two components of the plan. One is basically a Word document that provides historical context for capital purchases, capital needs. It provides past tax rates, past purchases, just other data that we felt was relevant to have always being updated, and we keep that on the website so it's always available to citizens. The other piece of that too is the Excel workbook, which has detailed all of the asset detail and projections and some expanded narrative on some projects. And that's the piece that we also, working with the accounting staff in the town hall, keep that updated throughout the year. We had some basic goals for our capital budget committee. We want to ensure that municipal assets benefit the town over the long term with, as again, Sarah alluded to, predictable, steady tax burden, which is achieved in a number of ways, one of which is the capital reserve funds she mentioned. The other point that she helped us also understand is intergenerational equity. Or, if we're buying a fire truck that's going to last 20 or 30 years, it's not necessarily fair to have the citizens who happen to be here in the first couple of years pay for all of that, figure out a way to spread that out over the life of the truck using capital reserves and good planning. It makes it easier to be better at that. Again, making sure that capital asset inventory needs priorities are transparent. That was something that was really driven home to us by many of our citizens, that they felt they wanted more, which totally, as I did too, more access to that information about what our capital needs are. That again, the whole prioritization process that Sarah described is a challenging one. The committee spoke with all of the department heads several times to go through that prioritization process. They spoke with Bill, the municipal manager, a number of times also on that. And then at the end of the day, we give a recommendation to the select board, and then just because we identify something as a priority doesn't mean it, as Sarah mentioned, it's necessarily going to get funded depending on what funds are available. Also, as part of that process, identifying other options for financing is really helpful. To do that as far in advance as possible helps when you're giving prioritization to certain projects. And then we were able to abide by our internal timeline, and we recommended a budget and a plan to the select board for approval, which is something that we'd never really had a formal plan to propose. So we accomplished that. The other thing, we recognize that this is always a work in process. We made mistakes in it. It's not, we want to improve it year over year, but at least we've started the process. So what we did really, we developed that comprehensive list of capital assets, working with the department heads. We'd meet several times a month to be sure that we had time to spend with them. We designed a structure of a plan narrative. Again, going back to the sort of town financial data, most people don't look back at past annual reports or town budgets. And so we just try to keep that in a very short document that has the relevant history of capital purchases for the town and what the implication of that has been on the rate. We developed working with Sarah, the planning and budgeting tool, the Excel workbook, trying to keep something as simple as possible for the town accounting staff to use. That's not going to be, if it gets too unwieldy, they're just not going to have the time to keep it updated, and we're going to slip back into where we were before. So trying to find something that was a happy medium between giving enough detail to keep the asset list accurate, but on the other hand, not be so detailed that, because it is going to be, off the books isn't the right term, but it's not part of the standard chart of accounts and data entry process. So it's going to be could feel like a little extra work. So trying to keep that as limited as possible, just to make sure that continue to use it. Also, our meetings were a chance to identify longer term projects and studies that might that other committees might have talked about, and just trying to have a place where they could all be gathered. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we recommended the capital budget to the select board, and I'll let Bill continue here.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So going forward, what are going to be our next steps? Because we know this is as Jonathan mentions, this is a work in progress. So we need to keep this moving. And as Sarah says, you don't want this to just go on the shelf somewhere. So here's some steps that the staff and myself and the boards are going to take. And of course, the capital budget committee are going to take moving forward. So clearly we're going to update the plan with information from the approved budget, because we know that you can put this plan on the shelf, but to make this operational, you got to put those numbers from that approved budget into this capital improvement plan. Also, we're going to need to update the master asset list of additions and removals. This is going to take the interaction with department heads and myself to work together in our finance team. We're going to need to update historical data into the plan narrative as well. We're going to need to review, prioritize purchases and projects with municipal staff. That'll include department heads, the finance team, and myself, to make sure that we are tackling those issues that are most important to the boards and most important that need to be taken on and corrected. We're going to need to review existing debt and revise future debt service obligations. We're going to need to evaluate project financing options. This could include, are we going to look at lease versus loan? Are we going to look at grants? Are we going to look at, obviously we're going to look at grants, but how will that play into our financing? Looking at ARPA infrastructure money that's going to be coming down, and how we can tie that into what we have as cash on hand, taking out loans and matching that with debt, and looking at that comprehensively. And then finally, developing a 24 capital budget and plan for subsequent years for select board adoption. So those are going to be our steps. It's good. As Jonathan says, it's a work in progress, and it's been a good group. And I want to congratulate the capital budget committee, and especially Jonathan, for his hard work on this, and as well as our department heads and our finance team for their hard work on this project. And we'd be happy to take any questions. Or maybe this isn't time for questions yet, but
That's okay. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Our last town
Sarah,
to
let me
talk.
jump in just for, I just want to jump in quick announcement.
Who's
We'll
hosting this
delay the
webinar?
Well, sorry.
Just kidding.
We'll delay the session until 10:30, the breakout session. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that there will be time for some questions here after our last presenter.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. And thanks again, Bill and Jonathan. All right, Aaron Frank, the town manager in Colchester, is here to talk about Colchester's capital planning process.
Sarah, Michael, I don't have the ability to start my video.
Yep, I'm trying to reclaim the host duties here. Just bear with me.
Sure.
We never promised we'd get everything right. There we go. Yeah, that should allow you to go on screen also.
Sure. All right. So first, Colchester really didn't get here by accident. It's been very difficult for the town of Colchester to pass major capital initiatives. We voted 3 times over 25 years before we could expand our sewer to the Mallet's Bay, a very environmental sensitive area. We voted twice before we could purchase 14 acres of land on the bay for future recreation use. So again, I inherited a lot of this, and have expanded it, but it's something that we don't really think happened by accident. It just kind of fits with the nature of Colchester and their interest in being fiscally conservative in their public financing. So first, I just want to talk about a few different aspects of our public financing. Of course, there's debt financing, multi-year capital plans, capital planning and approval, and then the financial aspects of our multi-year capital plans. So debt financing, most folks know about this. Here's just a snapshot of how ours works. We've got about $410,000 annually, or about $2.3 million in general fund debt. It's voter approved. You can see some of the projects that we have used to fund through debt financing. And we're now able to pay that through local option tax revenues, which are dedicated to only fund projects that the voters approve on town meeting day. So the benefits of a multi-year capital funding approvals is that they provide consistent funding for capital needs. They reduce pressures to defer capital in favor of operating expenses. This was 1 year we were trying to keep the operating budget low due to pressures on the community and taxpayers. And one might be tempted to suppress some capital needs in favor of operating expenses, money of which can't really be avoided, but this separate capital funding really prevents you from doing that, which is often a very good thing, especially if you think about items like bridges or roofs on buildings or things that just have to be maintained for public safety. It also avoids the needs for bonds, loans, and interest costs related thereto. And importantly for Colchester, it avoids spikes in taxes, which people really do not like. And we have found it has been advantageous in grant planning and grant procurement. So here's a table showing some of our capital plans. We have separate ones for kind of like items. We have one for vehicles, equipment, and facilities. You can see it's a certain amount on the tax rate and the estimated FY23 authorizations. We have one for capital transportation, which is roads and paths and sidewalks related to roads, very significant. We have one for park capital, public safety capital, kind of smaller items that didn't fit anywhere. We created a special plan for that. Technology, which is where we put computers and servers, that kind of stuff. Communications is for public safety base systems and kind of the heavier and more expensive things, repeaters, that kind of stuff. We in the past had a bridge fund and we're able to replace a bridge, or at least the significant local match that came with that. And we're in the process of developing a fire department capital plan, having consolidated 3 separate departments into a single department. So we've got a smattering of these. I think about every other year we have one that's going to be reauthorized by the voters. So it's kind of normalized. And again, how this works in Colchester is the voters authorize the funding from anywhere from 5 years to some of them are as long as 20 years. I think Sarah mentioned earlier, you got to think of the life of the assets, and some of the assets, especially with capital vehicles and equipment, we have graders we try to keep for 25 years. So we think of planning the plans for some of the life of the assets, or at least considering them. We also share with the public some of the things that we use for these plans. It helps with the public pitch on what we used it for the last time. Here's just some nice pictures that you can see that we've shared with folks and some of the nice outcomes with the park capital plan that was reauthorized this year. We also share what we're going to do with reauthorizations. A lot of folks want some more sidewalks, especially on East Lakeshore Drive, Mallets Bay Avenue. And so this is at least in the planning phase in the capital transportation plan that was reauthorized this town meeting day. People also like for their roads to be repaved in a reasonably timely manner. And so we show the years in which we plan to repave the roads in these capital plans. That helps with the authorization. And it also helps us when we're thinking of bidding and capital contracts. Sometimes we can save up 2 or 3 years, and then we have a larger amount of roads to pave, and sometimes we can get a better bid from the paving contractors. So here's how the questions work on the ballots, and I'll just read one of them. For continuing a plan, shall the town of Colchester reauthorize the select board to maintain a reserve fund accumulating annually for the continuation of a tax rate in the amount of 3.25 cents per $100 of capital of property value. And something that these let us do is we really have an adaptive plan. So if there's a pickup truck or even a public works plow truck, we'll look at it, even though there's a plan to replace it. We look at it and say, does it really need to replace this year? And oftentimes we can defer those and just know that we have the funding available because it is in a reserve fund that spans fiscal years and allows us to push things out. Even if you push them out half a year, if you're pushing out a bunch of different stuff, it saves money over time. And it really separates this from putting an operating budget that expires at the end of the fiscal year. I know one way folks deal with this is sometimes they put things into a reserve fund, but pretty much all your capital is in a reserve fund to begin with. You can be more rational about it and kind of treat it like it was a private business or a personal item that you wouldn't necessarily replace just because it had met your plan. So these are some of the funding approvals. And then we do have a capital budget program in addition to the voter approved items. And we share this annually with the select board. It's developed with multiple departments and groups that use capital. It first goes to the select board, then goes to the planning commission, goes out for public hearing, and identifies how things relate to Vermont statutes, the town charter, and other such things. And you can see some of the reasons and purposes of the use of funds here. So again, our capital budget program, it's required by state statutes, and here's some of the things it includes: executive summary, legal authority, prior year of expenditure, so people can see what we use the resources for last year, expected program revenues. We often include grants, and we also have a large capital funding candidate list that we review every year and look for opportunities to fund. As with, I'm certain, every community in the state, we have more needs and wants than we do availability to fund. So again, here's a little bit about the process and a little bit about the outcome. So projects, but not the funding, is authorized, and the partners are informed by the capital budget program. The separate voter approved capital plans are how the funding is authorized. So again, here's just a little bit more about some of our year in review, some of the things that we have done to upgrade and include the community. They love pictures, concrete examples of what's really done. It's a good opportunity to share that, and some other future things, some parks, some transportation, some community items. So here's how we share this capital budget program out. It's easy to share it internally, but we want to make sure and share it with the utilities, especially the underground utilities in the area. We don't have a lot of them, but there's some areas such as Vermont Gas is underground in Vermont, the school district, and we have separate fire districts that provide water services, and of course Champlain Water District. So we want to make sure we know, make them aware of when we are planning improvements, especially transportation improvements, so that they can make their cuts before we put in a new sidewalk, path, or road. So here's how this looks and relates back to our tax warrant that the select board approves in July. You can see in the bottom half, we separate the approved articles, and up top you can see where our municipal general service operating budget is. So we're very separate and deliberately separate about explaining what is capital and what is operating in Colchester. It seems that works. Folks usually have a very high pass rate on the capital items, and it shows to us that they support this approach and the continuation of it. So again, I think this was touched on earlier, but there's just different types of funds that you can use from a fiscal perspective, and debt service is one kind of fund, and then you can see how we categorize the capital transportation through public safety equipment funds. And again, these plans, whether they're 5 years or 20 years, they live for the life of the voter authorizations. So you don't have to vote on them every single year. We just are able to implement that tax rate that is authorized. And it's very helpful, as I said, to make sure that you're able to maintain the assets that you have. So that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aaron, and our other panelists. We have about 15 minutes now for questions.
So question in the chat, does the capital plan require voter authorization?
I guess, or Aaron, I see you just unmuted.
Sure. So the capital budget plan is approved by the select board and it goes through the planning commission and there's a public hearing process. So that part does not require voter authorization. The funding for our capital plans does require voter authorization. So as I shared, those are town meeting day style questions. Shall the town create a reserve fund or maintain a reserve fund in such and such amount? So it's a little of both, I think, is the answer, at least from Colchester.
Thanks, Aaron. When I was in Essex, we had a 2-cent capital tax, and that was originally approved by the voters. And then annually, the capital plan was approved just by the select board after the required public hearing as well.
A question for me for Chester. Julie spoke about the role of debt. I think in the prior efforts, one thing I think we've heard from Aaron, and I'd be curious from Woodstock as well, is that oftentimes there's a constraint that sort of necessitates the development of the capital plan. And Julie, from what happened in Chester, there was obviously a lot, there was some debt issuance, but was there a reaction to that? Sort of what was the impetus then to say, okay, enough is enough, let's start doing some long-term planning?
I think it became, we started getting some pushback from the voters, naturally. All of a sudden now we have this debt. What really, I think, pushed it over the edge was the need for a new emergency services building and repairs to the town garage at a little over $4 million. So we started really looking at, now we're just accumulating debt. We're financing a dump truck for 4 years. Is that the smartest thing to do? So it all kind of came to a head, and there was so much debt that there was no more building of capital. It was all about debt. And I think it was really the voters that started asking the questions.
Thank you. And then in Woodstock, what were, were there certain constraints that sort of led this more recent effort there to sort of get serious about the capital plan?
Yeah, actually, I think what really occurred was we've had 2 major capital projects that have come up in the last couple of years. We had an emergency services building, which cost $4.5 million, a $4.5 million bond, and then the South Woodstock wastewater plant, which came out to be a $2.8 million bond. And in addition to that, we also need to upgrade our main plant, which could be anywhere from 8 to 18 and possibly more $1 million. So we had big capital projects. So the boards were looking at this and thinking, okay, we need to up our ante here and really revisit this and really have a plan in place to take some of the burden off the taxpayers and really look at planning going forward and what efforts we can make to find other funding sources and better planning going forward for these purchases. Yeah.
Something we see at every scale of government. There's some sort of concern about affordability or about potential threats to affordability. From District of Columbia to Chester, Vermont, those are common themes in pushing some really good thinking about capital planning. So it would be best to avoid the sort of crisis situation, but sometimes that's the way to get people focused. Okay, any other questions here, either in the chat or in the Q&A function? Right, very good. So now moves on to the portion we're gonna take a little break here and then regroup in our breakout sessions. We're experimenting here at the first annual Vermont Capital Planning Forum. It's obviously going to be a lot easier to have breakout sessions in person, but for the time being, you should have received a separate Zoom link from me that will be a meeting format where everyone will be able to see, where folks can get together share some ideas, have some prompts about issues they're facing in one of three categories: connecting sort of a community vision to a capital plan, getting your head around asset inventory, asset prioritization, and then finally integrating the various funding sources that are out there. Our hope is that we can use this as a dialogue to share ideas, but also collect topics of interest that we could pursue for other sessions like this one in the future, as if there's some consistency in the issues or obstacles that folks are facing. So with that, why don't we sign off? We'll be back here after that event, which will end now. Our next session in the webinar will be at 11 a.m. We'll talk about debt capacity and debt affordability. Excuse me. But for the time being, go to the link for the meeting. If you didn't receive one, you can email me, michael@vtbondagency.org, and I'll get you hooked up. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you at 10:30.